If you're a sports bettor and looking to improve your betting, I don't think there's any better way than to be listening to betting podcasts. There's so many great betting podcasts out there hosted by professional sports bettors or people that are really experienced in the industry. And I guess the podcast format allows people to have in-depth discussions about all sorts of topics around betting. Last week, I saw a great article by the Smart Betting Club about their top 5 sports betting podcasts. So I thought I'd join in on the fun and give out my top 5 sports betting podcasts also. Before I get into my top 5, it's probably important to mention that generally there are 2 different types of podcasts out there. So one is like betting previews or where people giving out tips on certain games that are coming up on the weekend, or maybe just an overall betting preview of a tournament coming up. And then there's the podcast where it's predominantly people interviewing another person. So someone interviewing a professional sports bettor, a bookmaker, anyone that's kind of involved in the industry. So for this top 5, I'm going to focus just on people that are conducting interviews, not the betting preview side of stuff. And as always, please feel free to comment at any time in the section below with your favorite podcasts or ones that you agree or disagree with me. There's a lot of great podcasts out there, so I'm sure I'll miss a few today. So please mention them below.
It is a scam when you don't allow everyone to operate on fair terms.
We are the Robin Hoods of sports betting. We take something back from the rich bookies and enable our customers to beat them instead.
The first podcast on my list today, and these are in no particular order, is the Circles Off podcast, which is hosted by professional sports bettors Rob Pizzola and Johnny from BetStamp. So one of my favorite things about this podcast is they bring on guests from around the betting world that people have never really heard of before, or just really unique guests that haven't been interviewed on other podcasts before. So it's not like you're hearing from the same person again. You're actually hearing from different kinds of people who are, doing unique things around the betting industry. Rob and Johnny are both professional sports bettors, which is a great element to have because they're asking the questions that everyone kind of wants answered. Maybe some podcasts forget to answer them because they're not professionals themselves. So some really interesting topics there they're able to discuss because of their wide-ranging knowledge of sports betting. I guess the only con to that would be if you are a beginner sports bettor or someone that's got very little knowledge of sports betting, you might get a little bit lost in some of their discussions. But I think, once you educate yourself, it's a really great stepping point to the next side of sports betting. My favourite episodes for the Circles Off podcast would be episode 16, which was their interview with Porter, who's a professional sports bettor. And the interesting about him is he specialises in player props. So it was really interesting to hear his approach and I guess the argument between player props versus some of those bigger markets. The other 2 I liked was their first mailbag episode, which was episode 17. They answered some really interesting questions there, which I love listening to. And lastly, recently they had professional sports bettor Spanky on the podcast. Spanky's been interviewed by quite a few podcasts and he has his own podcast, but I thought this was like one of the most interesting conversations, or at least the most interesting conversation I've heard him be a part of out of all the podcasts I've heard him on before. So highly recommend those 3 episodes in particular. The second podcast on my list is the Smart Betting Club podcast, hosted by the founder of Smart Betting Club, Pete Ling. The Smart Betting Club is a tipster verification service, so their podcast is centered around Pete interviewing certain tipsters, I guess finding the ins and outs of their service, how they found an edge in betting, etc., etc. What this does is it allows for some great topics and you get a range of different tipsters like football tipsters, horse racing tipsters, etc., where you really get to understand everyone's, got a different way of, I guess, finding value in the market. So it's really interesting to go through each person's process. Pete's recently started up a new series on the podcast called Betting Clever, which I highly recommend giving a listen to also, where they talk about more general topics in sports betting. So I look forward to seeing more of those episodes soon. If I had to pick out a favourite episode or episodes, I'd probably have to go with episode 1 and 2. So taking it right back to the start, I really enjoyed Pete's chats with both Tom Brownlee and Greg Gordon. Hearing some of Tom's ways to utilize betting shops is a really interesting listen, and also Greg's way that he approaches his football betting from, I guess, like a scouting point of view is really interesting stuff. So I highly recommend those episodes. And he's also talked to guys like Mark O'Hare and Anthony Kaminskas, who we've had on our podcast too. And yeah, like always, those guys are really interesting guys to listen to. The Business of Betting podcast is next on my list, which is hosted by Jake Williams. Now, out of all the podcasts I'll mention today, this is probably the most diverse podcast because it interviews people from, professional sports bettors to bookmakers to investors, and it's a really wide range of guests that you'll get on the podcast. So if you're really interested in the business side of sports betting, so I guess getting more of an overall view of how each sector of the industry operates, then I highly recommend this podcast as a good listen. There are 170 episodes of the Business of Betting podcast, so it's quite hard to pick out the best ones. But if I had to just pick a few, I'd say if you're looking at the sports betting side of things, like actually learning from people who bet for a living, I'd highly recommend episode 147 with Dan Shan and 152 with Johnny from BetStamp. I thought both of those conversations were really engaging and gave people a lot to ponder and think about as they move forward in their sports betting journeys. And if you want to look more into the business side of things, I highly recommend episode 143 with Tom Waterhouse and also 167 with Zach Reynolds. Both of these guys kind of talked about betting content and I guess the marketing side of things when trying to get people to bet with bookmakers, which I thought was really interesting. Next on the list is the podcast Be Better Betters, which is hosted by Spanky, who's a professional sports bettor. The great thing about this podcast is Spanky interviewing professional sports bettors and bookmakers, but also he just does podcasts by himself where he talks about certain things in sports betting. Like sometimes he talks about the importance of closing line value. He once broke down, I guess, all the players in sports betting, like all the different people in the industry, which is always really interesting stuff. So a great element too is the fact that Spanky's a professional sports bettor, and he's been doing this for a long, long time. So he's got lots of great stories to tell, and some of the people that he interviews have also been in the industry for 30, 40 years. So they're going to have lots of experience and some really interesting things to say about how it's evolved over time. My two favourite episodes of Spanky would be when he interviewed professional sports bettor Fats, which is really, really interesting. Someone that had worked with Billy Walters in the past, which I just found so interesting. So I highly recommend listening to that one. And the other podcast I highly recommend is when he was just talking by himself and he talked about building relationships in the sports betting industry and how he's been able to build relationships with all sorts of people around the world. So I highly recommend listening to that too. Last on my list is Bet the Process, which is hosted by Rufus Peabody and Jeff Maher. This podcast, I think, is quite similar to the Circles Off podcast, as if you've got two people who are really experienced in the sports betting industry, and it's a mixture between them interviewing people and also just having general discussions between themselves about current betting events that are going on. Like some of the other podcasts, it's hard to pick out a favourite episode because there's just been so many over the years. I believe the podcast has been running for 4 or 5 years. But if I had to pick out some of the more recent ones, one of the first ones that attracted me to the podcast was actually their chat with Rob Pizzola, who's a professional sports bettor and he's the host of Circles Off podcast. That was back in June of 2020. I thought that was a really interesting chat about, I guess, finding value and how you can be betting different sides of a golf matchup and still be value on both sides depending on when you bet it. So that was a really interesting discussion between Rob, Rufus and Jeff. And a more recent episode where they interviewed a professional sports bettor, Shane Sigsby. I really enjoyed that. I think it was season 4, episode 25. So highly recommend listening to that too. Shane's a really interesting guy and he's really open about how he approaches his sports betting, and there's certainly lots of information for people to grasp there. And that were my top 5 sports betting podcasts to make sure you listen to. Some honourable mentions, the Pinnacle podcast. Awesome podcast, but they haven't really released an episode in a long time where they're interviewing people in the industry. But their host Ben was superb when he was working with them, and there's some really interesting conversations if you just skip back a few episodes to when he was doing those one-on-one interviews. And if you're interested in the betting preview side of things, then I highly recommend the Matchbook podcast and also the Betfair podcast. They both do a terrific job of breaking down some of the weekend's betting events that go on every single weekend. But thanks for watching, everyone. As I said before, please comment any suggestions for other podcasts that I've missed or any disagreements that you have, or maybe you have some agreements. That would be nice. But other than that, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, do all the good stuff, and I will see you guys very soon. Cheers.